My son sent me a message. Do not come to our house anymore. We want peace. I took that in silence and let it be. But come the following morning, it was him standing at my door, fist pounding. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here for this one. If you haven't already, tap that subscribe button so the next story finds its way to you. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something from what you've heard so far. Who are you already in Gerald's Corner for, and why? Drop it in the comments below. Now, a quick note. Some elements of this story have been shaped for storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific, real individuals is purely coincidental, but the message at the heart of it is very real. Do not come to our house anymore. We want peace. I read those words twice, letting the cold reality of his arrogance settle over me. There had been no screaming match, no explosive family blow-up to set this off. I had simply shown up to their Sunday dinner and raised one logical question about a glaring $10,000 discrepancy I had spotted in his startup's quarterly projections. Nadia had taken immediate offense, rolling her eyes and walking away from the table, declaring my presence overbearing and damaging to her mental health. Derek entirely captive to his need to feed her. Vanity had chosen to exile the man bankrolling his entire existence. I did not sit there weeping over that message. I did not draft some lengthy emotional reply, cataloging the decades of sacrifice that had put the tailored suit on his back. I was a retired logistics manager. I dealt in efficiency in the cold mathematics of supply and demand, not in melodrama. I typed one word, understood. I hit send and set the phone face down on the granite counter. For 3 years, I had been the invisible engine propping up his artificial empire. I had quietly covered the commercial lease for Derek's tech startup loft in the short North Arts District, Columbus, Ohio, a sprawling space that bled money month after month without turning a profit. I had dutifully covered the steep property taxes on Derek and Nadia's luxury home in Dublin, Ohio, a house chosen deliberately to impress people they privately despised. I opened my laptop and pulled up my primary banking portal. The interface loaded, showing the automated transfers queued for the first of the month. $6,500 drained from my hard-earned savings every 30 days. I opened a secondary spreadsheet, eyes moving down the columns, as my mind worked the aggregate figures. Over 4 years, I had poured exactly $312,000 into their unearned comfort. I clicked into the recurring payments menu. The cancellation option was right there. I did not hesitate. I pressed confirm and permanently severed the financial lifeline, but the banking infrastructure I had built to protect him immediately set off a chain reaction. Because Derek was listed as a secondary account holder on the business funnel, the bank's automated system generated a high-priority email alert, notifying him of the impending financial halt. The quiet cutoff I had intended was instantly broadcast to the one person who depended on it most. Fewer than 2 minutes later, my phone began vibrating hard against the countertop. Derek's name flashed repeatedly on the screen. I watched it for a moment, observing the panic taking shape in real time, then pressed the mute button. The ringing became a silent, rhythmic pulse in the background as I went deep into the finances. I shifted my attention to a thorough audit of every joint account and credit line I had set up to help him build his financial footing. I had sold my entire freight logistics company 5 years prior, liquidating my life's work to provide the seed capital for his venture. I had willingly traded the prospect of a well-funded retirement for a modest single-story house. Also, my son could have the ultimate head start. As I worked through the digital ledgers, tracing the money trail past the canceled transfers, a stark anomaly stopped me cold. There was a secondary loan tied directly to the deed of my own home. My chest tightened. I pulled up the digitized loan documents and scanned the authorized signatures. Derek and Nadia had not simply been living off my monthly transfers. They had secretly leveraged the equity in my personal property to secure a $150,000 line of credit. They had forged digital authorization drawing against the very roof over my head to fund a lifestyle they could not sustain on their own. The nauseating truth hit me like a physical blow. If they defaulted on their extravagant spending, the bank would foreclose on my modest home. They had not merely taken my generosity, they had actively collateralized my survival. The smoldering betrayal hardened into something colder and absolute. I picked up my phone bypassing Derek's 37 missed calls and dialed the private number of my longtime attorney, Clifton. Despite the late hour, Clifton answered on the second ring. I skipped the pleasantries and said nothing about a broken family. I instructed him to freeze all tied lines of credit immediately and place a maximum security fraud alert on my social security number. Clifton paused, his sharp legal mind rapidly calculating the logistical consequences of such a move. He cautioned me that freezing the commercial accounts would cause Derek's payroll and vendor checks to bounce the instant the banks opened at dawn. The startup would hit a catastrophic wall, facing total insolvency by noon. I told Clifton to execute the order immediately and prepare the paperwork to remove my name from their debts. I closed the laptop and went to the hallway closet for my heavy toolbox. Over the next 2 hours, I methodically replaced the brass deadbolts on both the front and back doors, physically revoking the access I had so freely handed them. I returned to the computer and updated the firmware on my home security system, resetting every password and access code to push them out of my digital perimeter as well. The long night slowly dissolved into a cold gray dawn. At exactly 6:00 in the morning, the security app on my tablet chimed sharply. I brought up the live high-definition camera feed. Derek was not standing on my porch to apologize or seek forgiveness. He was pacing furiously in the biting morning air, hammering his fists against my reinforced oak door. His face was twisted in arrogant rage, and in his right hand he gripped a thick stack of legal documents. The trap had arrived right on schedule. The relentless pounding against that reinforced door shattered the quiet of the early morning house. Gerald stood in the dimly lit foyer, his breathing steady, completely unmoved by the frantic rhythm reverberating through his home. He glanced at the antique mantel clock resting on the hallway shelf. It was exactly 6 hours in the morning. 12 hours earlier, he had been banished from his son's life by a callous text demanding peace and permanent distance. Now that same son was trying to beat the door down. Gerald reached out calloused hands, moving with deliberate precision. He turned the heavy brass deadbolt, but left the thick security chain firmly in place. He opened the door just far enough to create a narrow 4-inch gap, a physical boundary that reflected the cold new reality between them. Derek stood on the porch, shivering in the biting morning air. The polished, arrogant tech executive from the previous evening had completely vanished. His expensive designer blazer was severely wrinkled. His hair was unkempt, and a sheen of cold sweat coated his pale forehead. He pressed his face nearly into the crack in the door, eyes wide with a desperate feral panic. He offered no apology for the cruel message he had sent the night before. He did not even manage a greeting. Instead, he immediately shoved a thick manila folder through the narrow opening and thrust a silver pen toward his father. Derek began speaking in a high, trembling voice, words spilling out in a chaotic rush of manufactured urgency. He claimed the commercial bank had made a catastrophic clerical error during the overnight server update. He insisted that corporate accounts for his startup were entirely frozen due to an automated compliance glitch, and that his payroll checks would bounce the moment financial institutions opened for business. He framed it as a simple administrative matter, just a routine update to the joint account authorizations they had established years ago. He pressed Gerald to sign the highlighted pages at once, claiming his primary investors were threatening to pull their capital, and that the bank manager was standing by for the scanned copies to release the frozen funds. Gerald did not react to the frantic performance. He did not show concern or pepper him with panicked questions about the failing business. He simply took the heavy folder through the gap, his expression an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. He drew his reading glasses from his breast pocket and put them on. For 35 years, Gerald had overseen global logistics networks and international shipping routes. His entire career had been built on catching lethal discrepancies in massive supply chain contracts. He had spent decades identifying hidden clauses, limiting corporate liabilities, and exposing vendors who buried excessive fees in the fine print of sprawling legal agreements. He knew precisely how to read a contract, and more to the point, he knew exactly how to read the person aggressively placing it in his hands. Gerald flipped past the deceptive cover page. The document was dressed in standard banking letterhead and familiar corporate logos, but its foundational formatting struck his trained eye as immediately wrong. The margins were slightly off, and the boilerplate language was unusually dense, clearly lifted and pasted from a different legal jurisdiction. He paid no attention whatsoever to the bright yellow sticky notes, marking where he was supposed to blindly place his signature. Instead, he directed his full focus to the dense paragraphs buried in the middle of the third page. The legal language was highly complex, deliberately engineered to overwhelm and exhaust any casual reader. For Gerald, the trap lit up like a flare fired into a pitch-black sky. Commercial lease compliance banking errors. The document had nothing to do with any of that. What Gerald held in his hands was a comprehensive, irrevocable financial power of attorney. He moved through each clause with the measured patience of a man who had spent a career parsing contracts, the cold morning air biting at his skin. The language was explicit. Derek would receive total, unchecked authority to liquidate Gerald's retirement portfolios, reach into his secured offshore holdings, and empty his private savings, all without so much as a prior phone call. The next page was worse. A provision buried in standard-sounding legalese would allow the named representative to transfer property deeds and offload real estate without the original owner's physical presence or spoken agreement. Further, in another paragraph, quietly erased Gerald's right to direct his own medical care and financial affairs, handing that power entirely to his son. This was no clerical stopgap for a cash-strapped company. It was a precision instrument of dispossession engineered to sever Gerald from every material thing he had built across a lifetime. On the far side of that chained door, Derek was losing patience. His leather shoes dragged across the frost-covered porch as he shifted from foot to foot. He smacked his palms against his thighs, griping about the cold and the vanishing minutes. He told Gerald to quit combing through the fine print and put his name on the bottom so they could both be done with it. The tactics were familiar. Derek had been running this same playbook since his teens, layering false victimhood over naked aggression. His employees would walk by noon, he said. The startup was hours from bankruptcy. Gerald was dragging his feet out of spite, punishing his son over a petty argument from the previous evening. He told his father that signing those papers was proof of loyalty, that it was the only way to save the company. Gerald lowered the document and looked through the gap at the man standing before him. Something inside him went very still, the last trace of fatherly feeling burned away by a clarity that was almost cold enough to hurt. This was the child he had dismantled his freight company for. This was the adult whose extravagant life he had quietly financed for years, trading away his own retirement comfort, so his son could remain untouched by hardship. The truth, when it arrived, was not gentle. Derek had not dashed off that dismissive text in a hot-headed moment. The banishment had been calculated, a deliberate move to push Gerald out of his life at precisely the right time, once the legal trap was ready to snap shut. This was never about saving a business. Derek's aim was total. Gerald's independence, his home, his dignity, all of it stripped away, leaving behind a man with no agency and no resources, entirely at his son's mercy. What staggered Gerald most was the confidence behind it. Derek had clearly concluded that his father was an aging, predictable man, the kind who would put his pen to anything set in front of him, driven by habit and a love he could no longer afford to extend. All those years of quiet sacrifice Derek had read as weakness. He had banked on Gerald's fear of his failure, overriding every instinct for self-preservation. Gerald said nothing. He made no move to raise his voice across the threshold. He did not rip the papers or fling them back through the gap. He stood motionless in the foyer, the weight of the folder in his grip, fully aware that what he held was the clearest proof he would ever have of his son's intent. This was the end of the line. Whatever bond had existed between them, whatever shared fiction of family loyalty, had just been permanently dissolved. The man pacing that porch was not someone to be shielded anymore. He was a threat that required a response. Gerald stood in that measured quiet, the 4-inch gap in the door unchanged, preparing his next move with the same deliberate logic he had applied to every major decision in his professional life. Derek's breath came in visible clouds in the freezing air. He had his legal papers clenched in both hands. He had expected Gerald to push back, to cry accuse, or at least deliver a pointed speech, about the money secretly pulled from the home equity line. Gerald offered none of it. He had learned long ago through 30-plus years of freight logistics that reacting emotionally to a system failure was simply inefficient. You don't curse at a machine that breaks down. You identify what's wrong and fix it. Derek pushed the manila folder through the opening, his voice pitched high and clipped as he ran through his rehearsed account of the bank's supposed compliance error and the frozen payroll, and the investors threatening to bolt. Gerald accepted the folder without comment, opened it, and let his eyes settle on the bold print near the top of the third page. Full financial power of attorney. Everything Derek had described, the clerical glitch, the frozen accounts, the simple formality, was cover for this. The document would give Derek the legal standing to cash out Gerald's retirement deed, away his property, and place him under supervised medical care, all without Gerald being present or consulted. Gerald stood with that knowledge pressing down on him like a stone. 30 years ago, he had sat across from a young Derek at a kitchen table, patiently going through the mechanics of balancing a checkbook. He had built his freight operation from the ground up, poured every available hour into it, given up holidays and weekends and the shape of the retirement he had once imagined so that his son would never have to start from zero. And now Derek was trying to make him legally disappear. The grief of it settled in Gerald's chest like something physical, but his expression gave away nothing. "Pass them through," he said. The words came out without warmth, without tremor. Derek hesitated, clearly wrong-footed by the absence of any argument, then fed the thick stack through the gap along with a cheap ballpoint pen, fully anticipating the capitulation of a beaten man. Gerald set the offered pen aside without looking at it. From the breast pocket of his cardigan he produced his own a friction pen he had carried since his years as a civil engineer, when catching errors in structural blueprints was part of the job. To the eye, its ink was indistinguishable from any other dark, clean, permanent looking. But apply enough heat or friction, and it vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but blank paper. Gerald had used it for decades to mark and correct errors in complex technical documents. Today, the error he was correcting was the most consequential of his life. He turned to the signature page without ceremony. He didn't read the clauses aloud. He didn't ask Derek to explain himself. He set the pen to paper and signed his name in full every loop and line of the signature Derek needed to move against him. He added the date. He verified that the marks looked unimpeachable. Then he passed the folder back through the gap. Derek seized it with the speed of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this. He went straight to the final page, found the signature, and stared at it. The desperate, overwound energy he had shown minutes before simply dropped away. In its place came a slow, spreading smirk, the look of a man who believes he has just won something decisive. "I'll take these directly to the bank manager," Derek said, the condescension barely concealed beneath a surface layer of false reassurance. "Don't give it another thought, Dad. Nadia and I will take it from here. You'll be looked after." "I know you will," Gerald said. Derek moved quickly down the driveway and climbed into his luxury sedan, the same vehicle Gerald had quietly settled the payments on 2 years before. Gerald watched until the taillights dissolved into the gray morning fog. The moment the car cleared the corner, he closed the oak door and threw the deadbolt. The period of watching and waiting was finished. He crossed the house to his private study and lifted the phone. Clifton answered on the second ring. The attorney had been awake and alert, primed by the previous night's conversation. "Clifton!" Gerald's voice was spare all logistical focus. "Derek was here this morning. He came with a financial power of attorney and tried to get me to sign it." A sharp word from Clifton. Papers rustled in the background. "Gerald, please tell me you didn't put your name on that. If he walks that document into a bank before noon, he has the legal authority to liquidate your retirement accounts. We'd spend years fighting him in civil court to recover anything, and by the time we got there, the money would be long gone." "I signed it," Gerald said, "but I used a thermal friction pen. It'll pass a visual check. The instant that document passes through the bank's high-speed imaging system, the laser heat will burn the ink away entirely." Derek is going to place a blank sheet of paper in their hands. A stunned, weighted silence stretched across the phone line. When Clifton finally broke it, his voice carried unmistakable admiration. "That buys us 2 or 3 hours at best." The moment the bank turns him away, he'll understand what you've done. He'll return. The panicked, desperate son performance will be finished. What comes back through that door will be a cornered man. I'm not asking for a few hours, Gerald said, his desktop already spinning to life in front of him. 10 minutes is all I require. Activate the contingency we mapped out last year. Everything, the full estate, liquid holdings, retirement portfolios, the deed to this property. I want it all moved into a blind and irrevocable trust immediately. On his end, Clifton's keyboard began to clatter. Gerald, I need you to understand what this commits you to. The moment those assets cross into an irrevocable blind, trust you no longer hold direct control over any of it. It becomes its own legal entity entirely separate from you. Derek won't merely be frozen out. That power of attorney he's carrying becomes worthless paper, because in the eyes of the law, you will possess nothing for him to seize. Do it, Gerald said. His tone ended the discussion. The attorney complied without another word. 10 minutes passed. Gerald stayed on the line through every second of it. He spoke his identity aloud for the record. He read off the authorization codes. He confirmed the routing numbers tied to his offshore holdings. On the monitor before him, the figures in his primary accounts fell away one balance at a time until each screen showed nothing. The funds hadn't disappeared. They had retreated behind a legal wall that no court maneuver of Derek's could ever scale. Transfer confirmed, Clifton said. The words settled with the gravity of something irreversible. Your estate now belongs solely to the trust. Nothing he does can touch you. Let him file every document he brought. He walked into a vault that's been emptied. Gerald set the receiver down and exhaled. Something close to relief moved through him, but the freight hauler's discipline that had governed his entire working life wouldn't allow him to settle. The digital side of his life still needed confirmation. He slid his hand into his coat pocket for his phone. He wanted to pull up the security camera feed. His fingers closed on nothing. He tried the breast pocket. He checked his trousers. He swept a hand across the desk. Something cold moved through him. During those tense seconds at the front door, Derek had pressed himself hard against the frame, selling the story of a man buckled by desperation and exhaustion. Gerald recalled the small collision between them, the almost casual graze of his son's arm. At the time, it had registered as nothing, but that smirk Derek had worn wasn't only about the forged signature. Derek had lifted Gerald's primary phone directly from his coat. On that device, unencrypted physician contacts, live email access, a private scheduling calendar. Gerald's eyes went back to the computer screen. The scale of what he'd failed to account for hit him like a physical weight. The soft thud of the landline handset settling into its cradle seemed to echo off the walls. Gerald did not move from his mahogany desk. He breathed slowly, deliberately. The trust instrument was locked and operational. His financial walls were solid. Every dollar he'd built over a career hauling freight coast to coast now sat inside a legal structure his son had no mechanism to penetrate. Clifton had carried out the whole operation with exactly the kind of clean, lethal efficiency Gerald had always required from the people he worked with. A moment of stillness settled over the study. Pale morning light drew long shadows along the hardwood. The adrenaline that had been sustaining him gradually drained away, replaced by the familiar, unsentimental clarity of a man whose career had been built on containing disasters before they spread. Money secured, but a properly run operation doesn't stop at one checkpoint. He still had to physically inspect the house. He needed camera confirmation that Derek's vehicle had actually left the block. He pushed back from the leather chair, checked his trousers, then worked his fingers into the pockets of his cardigan. He was after his phone, specifically the surveillance app. Both pockets gave him nothing but cloth. Gerald's brow tightened. Routine was the backbone of everything he did. That phone lived in one of two places, left breast pocket or the narrow table just inside the front entrance. He left the study and walked the length of the hall toward the foyer where the morning's confrontation had played out. The little side table held nothing. No keys, no wallet, not a single object. Gerald came to a stop in the middle of the entryway. Eyes shut, he walked himself back through the last 30 minutes with methodical care. The deadbolt turning, the 4-inch opening the chain allowed. His son's face flushed damp, performing panic. Then the moment he'd been looking for came back to him sharp and clear. When Derek had grabbed the signed document back through the gap, He'd thrown himself off balance on purpose. His shoulder went hard into the heavy oak frame in a convincing show of relief-induced collapse. In that same instant, while Gerald's attention was on the door, Derek's free hand had moved through the gap with practiced ease. Every bit of it was choreographed. Derek hadn't come merely to deceive his father into surrendering assets. His second objective was to walk away with Gerald's phone, the nerve center of his communications and home security. This was no crime of opportunity. It was a deliberate second strike within a larger coordinated offensive. A cold, hard alertness replaced whatever relief Gerald had felt moments before. The financial fortress was intact, but that phone was an open book, his full private world sitting unprotected in Derek's hands. He wheeled around and went straight back to the study. Both monitors came to life as he settled into the chair. He pulled up his cloud management dashboard without pausing. A remote wipe was the only answer. Purge everything before Derek could pull anything useful from it. The dashboard asked for his password. He entered it without hesitation. Then it asked for a two-factor code, the code that would be sent automatically to the stolen device. A hard jolt of alarm moved through Gerald. Derek had seen this coming. The man ran a technology company. Network security and digital architecture were his native terrain. He had understood when he took the phone that he was also taking the one key, capable of locking his father out of his own data. That was the plan. But Gerald had spent 40 years engineering workarounds for exactly this kind of catastrophic failure point. From a locked desk drawer, he produced a physical security key on a small metal ring. He seated it in the computer's port and held his thumb against the biometric pad. The system dropped the phone requirement and opened the full cloud dashboard to him without further challenge. He went directly to the device management panel and brought up the map. His phone appeared as a moving point. It was tracking fast down the interstate aimed at the commercial district. He issued the permanent wipe order, a full factory reset, every file destroyed. The screen showed a progress bar working through the command. Then it completed. The marker disappeared from the map. But Gerald needed to account for the 20-minute window Derek had spent with an active unlocked device in his possession. He pulled up the remote activity log and began to read. The entries arranged themselves on screen in cold sequential order. Derek had not gone near the banking applications. He would have known those doors were already sealed. What the log showed instead was a fast, deliberate raid on a completely different area of the phone. Derek had left the financial folders untouched and gone straight for the personal medical records. Every physician's contact, every recent pharmacy prescription, every digital health insurance document had been pulled and copied. The knowledge of it struck Gerald like something blunt and heavy. This offensive had moved past money entirely. What Derek was building toward was dominion over his father's physical freedom. The memory of Miriam arrived without warning, quiet and devastating. Miriam had been taken by early-onset dementia. Gerald and Derek had stood together and watched the illness dismantle her over 5 years of grinding loss. Derek knew the law's machinery around cognitive decline from first-hand experience. He understood down to the specific documents required how a person could be legally stripped of the right to govern their own life. He was turning the story of his own mother's suffering into a weapon aimed at his father. Gerald kept scrolling and felt the temperature in his chest drop. The last entry logged before the wipe order went through was an outgoing message. Derek had composed an email from Gerald's account. Gerald navigated to the sent folder. The recipient was the attending physician at a prominent behavioral health clinic in Columbus, Ohio. The subject line read, "Urgent evaluation required." Gerald read through what his son had written and watched the full architecture of the scheme reveal itself. Every word of it was drafted in Gerald's own voice in the first person. Derek was putting words in his mouth. The email declared that he was suffering through violent episodes of confusion and terrifying memory loss. It alleged that extreme paranoia had taken hold of him, that he was convinced his own family was conspiring to rob him blind and destroy everything he'd built. The message formally demanded an emergency behavioral intervention, urging the clinic to reach Derek immediately and arrange an involuntary evaluation on the grounds that he could no longer be trusted behind the wheel or to make sound judgments for himself. The architecture of the scheme was brutally transparent. Derek had calculated that the financial theft might not hold. He understood the power of attorney could shatter against whatever legal defenses his father had quietly assembled. So he had shifted course, immediately pivoting towards something far more dangerous and difficult to undo. He was constructing the official medical foundation for a forced conservatorship. By sending fabricated confessions of cognitive collapse through his father's own email address, Derek was manufacturing a paper trail of documented insanity. He was engineering a written history of paranoid delusions in Gerald's name. The phone hadn't been taken as an afterthought or out of spite. It was a precision instrument, the exact tool needed to establish that his father's mind was failing. The battle over money had escalated into a war over Gerald's basic liberty. Gerald sat with the glow of the monitor washing over him as the full weight of the betrayal pressed down on the room. A cold mechanical clarity took command of his thinking. The stolen device was an open wound in his defenses. Derek had gone around the financial wall by striking at the personal data underneath it. The compromised phone had to be severed from his life with surgical completeness. He pulled up the master panel for his cloud architecture and began stripping out security tokens one by one. He disconnected the stolen handset from his email infrastructure and his private messaging channels. He pushed through the final wipe command, burning the hardware back to its original factory state. The system confirmed remote destruction of the data, but Gerald understood the real damage had already been done. That fraudulent message was already waiting in a physician's inbox at the behavioral health clinic in Columbus, Ohio. Derek had planted the first official document in what could become a forced medical intervention. Gerald leaned back against the leather chair. He had closed the digital wounds, but the psychological assault had already punched through his front line. The suffocating stillness of the house was broken without warning by a soft musical chime. It hadn't come from the main alarm panel, mounted near the front entrance. The sound originated from a dedicated security tablet sitting at the corner of his mahogany desk. That secondary system fed exclusively from a network of discrete motion sensors, buried throughout the rear landscaping. Gerald moved his eyes to the surveillance monitor. The infrared feed from the camera covering the back patio stuttered on in sharp black and white. A slender shape was cutting through the thin morning mist with purpose. The figure kept close to the trimmed hedges, staying out of range of the automated lights. This wasn't Derek doubling back for another confrontation. The refined bearing and the expensive designer trench coat made the identity unmistakable. It was Nadia. Gerald pushed back from the desk without making a sound. 4 decades of walking through silent, darkened warehouses after closing had given him the ability to move without announcing himself. He crossed the hallway in long, deliberate strides. He skirted the lit foyer and slipped into the unlit kitchen. His back went flat against the cool plaster wall. He eased himself into the deep shadow thrown by the large stainless steel refrigerator. Through the narrow horizontal slats of the window blinds, he had an unobstructed sightline to the back patio. Nadia had positioned herself just outside the window of his private study. There was no performance of concern, no tears, no appeal for a conversation. She had a thick steel flathead screwdriver in her grip, knuckles blanched white as she drove the metal tip into the bottom seam of the window frame and worked it hard. Gerald read the tactical shift immediately. Derek had almost certainly called Nadia from his car the moment the bank turned him away, telling her the accounts were sealed behind a trust she couldn't touch. Blocked from the digital assets they had wheeled around and aimed at the physical vulnerabilities instead. The window Nadia was working to force open sat directly above his heavy steel filing cabinets. Those drawers held decades of irreplaceable documentation, original birth certificates, sensitive tax records, historical property deeds. Precisely the kind of foundational paperwork a cornered couple would need to fabricate identities or build a fraudulent legal case for a medical conservatorship. Gerald didn't announce himself. He didn't pound on the glass or throw the patio lights on to scatter her. He held the silence. He reached across the granite kitchen island and his hand found the compact digital camera. He kept there, always charged, always ready for photographing property damage or documenting insurance claims. He pulled the lens cap free and raised the camera to his eye. He settled the lens between the slats of the blinds and pressed record. The camera captured crisp, high-definition footage of his daughter-in-law in the act of attempting a felony break-in. Nadia grunted softly in frustration. Her expensive boots lost traction on the wet grass as she threw her full weight behind the makeshift pry bar. The window frame groaned under the force, but the glass held firm. A decade earlier, a rash of bold burglaries had moved through the surrounding neighborhoods. Gerald had answered by fitting every ground floor window with heavy-duty steel locking pins and shatterproof security film, a costly and painstaking upgrade that Derek had dismissed at the time as the worried overreaction of an old man throwing money away. Today, that so-called overreaction was holding the line. Nadia drove the screwdriver against the locking mechanism one last time. Her expression curdled into something ugly and desperate when the tool jumped and gouged a ragged scratch across the exterior paint. She threw a look over her shoulder. Her eyes swept the quiet street, visible past the wooden fence line. She knew the window of darkness was closing. The morning foot traffic would be starting soon, and exposure meant everything unraveling. Beaten by the reinforced window, Nadia stepped back from the glass and onto the wet lawn. She buried the steel tool in her coat pocket. Gerald kept the camera up, fully expecting her to retreat toward the side gate. Instead, she crossed the yard and fixed her attention on the large cylindrical water filtration unit standing against the exterior brick wall of the kitchen. It was a custom aeration and purification system Gerald had installed to process the hard city water before it reached the main lines running through the house. Nadia moved toward the holding tank with purpose. She swept the yard with one final look. Then her hand went into the opposite pocket and came out holding a small and unmarked dark glass vial. Gerald went completely still in the darkened kitchen. The camera recorded every calculated second without interruption. Nadia twisted off the cap of the vial. Not a flicker of hesitation crossed her face. She raised the heavy access lid of the filtration unit and tipped the vial directly over the open aeration grate. A steady stream of fine white powder sifted downward into the tank. The substance touched the water and dissolved on contact, drawn immediately into the circulating supply that fed every tap and drinking glass in the house. Nadia inverted the vial and tapped the bottom until it ran empty. She pocketed it, snapped the filtration lid back into place, and moved at a near run toward the side gate. The latch clicked behind her, and the morning fog swallowed her whole. Gerald brought the camera down slowly. His hands had stayed rock steady through every financial maneuver, every trust transfer, every security protocol. Now an involuntary tremor moved through his fingers. Something primitive and suffocating rose in him as the full shape of their plan locked into place with horrifying precision. The stolen phone had been used to send a fabricated account of severe confusion and memory loss to the behavioral health clinic in Columbus, Ohio. The white powder now circulating through his water supply was the physical mechanism designed to turn those fabrications into reality. This had moved well beyond raiding his bank accounts or seizing his property records. They were poisoning him inside his own home. They intended to manufacture the exact delirium, the exact erratic and paranoid behavior that Derek had so carefully described in that forged medical email, and then point to a doctor as a witness. Their plan was to erase him legally, not through any overt act, but by methodically dismantling his mind from within. Gerald stood alone in the darkened kitchen, peering through the wooden blinds at the contaminated water tank sitting outside. The soft, rhythmic hum of the filtration motor traveled through the glass. It no longer registered as a household appliance. It sounded precisely like the steady, relentless ticking of a live bomb. Gerald did not linger for a single moment, staring at the contaminated tank. He moved with the deliberate precision of a man handling a live explosive. He pushed through the back door and walked directly to the heavy utility panel, bolted against the brick exterior wall. He seized the thick iron lever of the main water valve and forced it downward, cutting off flow to the entire property. The filtration motor's steady hum died abruptly. The silence that settled in its place was thick and heavy with malicious intent. Gerald knelt on the damp morning grass beside the aeration tank. He understood that any hesitation would allow the chemical agent to further break down and compromise the integrity of his physical evidence. He retrieved a sterile metal collection canister from his emergency supply kit in the garage. He carefully unscrewed the heavy plastic lid of the filtration unit. A faint powdery chemical odor drifted up from the stagnant water pooled inside the drum. It was a sharp, unnatural scent that fully confirmed his worst and most terrifying fears. He drove the canister deep into the tank, capturing the milky residue swirling near the bottom grate. He sealed the lid tight and wiped the exterior clean with a dry cloth. He was no longer a retired logistics manager watching a broken system from the sidelines. He was actively securing the weapon his own family had deployed against his mind. Gerald walked back to his private study and locked the canister inside his leather briefcase. From the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk, he pulled out his backup prepaid mobile phone. His primary device was in his son's hands, but Gerald had spent his entire career engineering redundancies into every operation that mattered. He dialed the number for the toxicology laboratory in the Easton Commercial District, Columbus, Ohio. He did not leave a message or sit through an automated menu. When the receptionist picked up, Gerald spoke with absolute and chilling authority. He demanded an immediate expedited chemical analysis and made clear that the cost of any rush order was of no concern whatsoever. He grabbed his keys and headed out the front door. The morning sun was burning off the heavy gray mist, but Gerald felt no warmth at all. He drove his sedan through the waking suburban streets, checking his rear view mirror with steady vigilance to confirm he had no tail. He arrived at the unmarked glass building of the Easton Commercial District Lab and went straight to the secure intake counter. He set the sealed canister on the cold stainless steel surface and paid the steep rush fee in crisp $100 bills drawn from his emergency reserve. He instructed the lead technician to run an emergency mass spectrometry panel targeting heavy sedatives and cognitive impairing narcotics. He demanded a legally binding certified report by mid-afternoon. The technician took one look at the cold intensity burning behind the older man's eyes and moved the canister directly into the priority testing queue. The toxicological proof was secured, but Gerald recognized it covered only half the battlefield. The chemical agent was engineered to manufacture symptoms, yet the real threat was the permanent legal diagnosis Derek intended to force upon him. Gerald returned to his car and opened the notepad application on his prepaid phone. He activated his premium concierge medical network, a luxury health service he had maintained for years despite Derek's persistent and aggressive pressure to cancel it as an unnecessary expense. That costly membership had now become his most powerful shield. Gerald contacted the concierge and directed them to secure immediate emergency appointments with 3 separate board-certified neurologists. He required that they be independent practitioners with no professional ties to one another, eliminating any basis for a bias claim. He wielded his accumulated financial resources like a battering ram smashing through the usual bureaucratic wait times and fully booked schedules. By 10 SAR in the morning, he was seated in the sterile, quiet waiting room of his first appointment. The clinical setting was cold and imposing, but Gerald sat upright and perfectly composed in a leather chair. When the first neurologist called him in, Gerald offered no vague complaints and wasted no time on pleasantries. He stated plainly that he required a comprehensive, legally admissible evaluation of his full cognitive functions. The doctor appeared startled by the sharpness of the request, but launched immediately into standard testing protocols. What followed was a grueling mental gauntlet. Gerald was made to memorize complex sequences of unrelated words and recite them back 30 minutes later. He worked through intricate spatial reasoning puzzles and navigated elaborate logical paradoxes without breaking stride. He reproduced intersecting geometric shapes from memory and performed rapid mathematical calculations without a moment's pause. His mind, the same one that had once managed global shipping fleets and contained international trade crises, ran with terrifying, flawless efficiency. He did not stumble on a single trick question. He did not falter during a single memory recall. The neurologist lowered his clipboard. He regarded Gerald with unmistakable professional admiration and declared that he possessed the cognitive processing speed and executive function of a man 20 years his junior. Gerald did not smile at that. He asked the doctor to put those precise words on an official certified medical affidavit and sign it with his full credentials. Gerald left the first clinic and drove straight across town to the second appointment. The process was repeated with identical mechanical precision. A new doctor administered a fresh battery of neurological and psychological tests. Gerald fielded rapid-fire questions on temporal orientation, historical recall, and complex problem-solving scenarios. He tracked moving targets on a digital screen and identified minute discrepancies in layered visual patterns. He directed every remaining ounce of his physical energy toward maintaining a flawless and composed exterior. He knew that any visible sign of fatigue or emotional strain could be seized upon by his son in a courtroom to argue instability. He answered every prompt with flat, undeniable clarity. The second neurologist signed a comprehensive declaration of full mental competency. Gerald secured the document inside his leather briefcase, alongside the receipt from the Easton Commercial District Laboratory in Columbus, Ohio. The relentless drive for medical proof carried him to the third and final clinic just past 1 hour in the afternoon. He was worn down by the sheer emotional weight of the betrayal, but his survival instinct delivered an unbroken reserve of adrenaline. The third neurologist held a reputation as the most exacting and uncompromising diagnostician in the entire state. He subjected Gerald to the most demanding and invasive behavioral evaluation of the entire day, probing for concealed anxieties, latent paranoia, and early indicators of dementia through aggressive conversational traps. Gerald sat across the polished wooden desk and methodically dismantled every diagnostic snare set before him. He spoke with clarity about his career, his logistical strategies, and his precise awareness of the present date and time. He demonstrated an unshakable, grounded command of his own reality. The examination ended with the doctor shaking his head in open disbelief at the mental acuity of his patient. He printed an official medical certificate confirming that Gerald showed zero cognitive decline and retained full, uncompromised executive control over his own affairs. Gerald walked out of the third clinic holding a thick envelope containing his ultimate salvation. He drove to a local notary office in Columbus, Ohio, and paid to have all 3 independent medical evaluations stamped and sealed. He now held an irrefutable time-stamped baseline of perfect mental health, a fortress of legal documentation assembled in the span of a few hours. That paperwork established beyond any doubt to any judge in the country that he was a fully capable and entirely autonomous adult. He laid the heavy folder on the passenger seat. The trap his son had tried to spring was now completely and utterly dismantled. Derek had stolen a smartphone to fabricate a sudden medical crisis, but Gerald had spent the entire morning erecting a towering wall of hard, irrefutable facts. As he turned the key in the ignition, his prepaid phone vibrated sharply in his pocket. It was the lead technician from the toxicology laboratory in the Easton Commercial District, Columbus, Ohio. The rush analysis of the water sample was complete. The chemical truth of what his family had introduced into his drinking supply was ready to be disclosed. Gerald shifted into gear and drove back toward the Easton Commercial District Laboratory, prepared to collect the final and most devastating piece of evidence he needed to dismantle their deception for good. Gerald was sitting in his sedan in the hardware store parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, when the prepaid mobile device buzzed against his thigh. He answered immediately. All professional composure had drained from the lead technician's voice. The man calling from the toxicology laboratory in the Easton Commercial District, Columbus, Ohio, sounded rattled, genuinely unsettled, in a way that made Gerald's stomach drop before a single finding was read aloud. "Pay close attention," the technician said. The mass spectrometry run had finished. That white residue lifted from the floor of the filtration tank was neither a cleaning agent nor a garden chemical. What it was a pharmaceutical-grade sedative concentrated well beyond any therapeutic threshold. The neurochemical breakdown that followed was delivered with a calm that made it all the more horrifying. Absorbed into the body over any 12 to 24-hour stretch, the substance would hammer the central nervous system into submission, not into unconsciousness, but into something far crueler. It was compounded specifically to trap its victim in a waking fog. Severe fragmentation of memory, total loss of spatial bearings, the ability to form a coherent sentence or follow a simple instruction would dissolve entirely. Anyone watching would see nothing but advanced senility. Gerald's knuckles went white around the steering wheel. The technician added that the concentration already introduced into the tank was more than enough to put an elderly person in a hospital bed. Did Gerald want him to notify law enforcement or poison control? No. Gerald told him to place the full written report in a sealed envelope and not release it to anyone but his attorney. He ended the call. Sitting alone in the car, Gerald became aware of a faint metallic bitterness at the back of his throat, the psychological residue of what he had just heard. They had not been trying to kill him. A corpse creates complications, a mandatory autopsy, a police file. Death was the wrong tool entirely, and they had known it. What they were after was something far more profitable than a funeral. They wanted a living ghost. They wanted him drawing breath, his heart still beating, while every legal right he possessed was stripped away and handed to them as his self-appointed guardians. Gerald drove back to his quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio. He rolled into the garage, cut the engine, and pulled the heavy metal door shut. He moved through the kitchen without stopping and stepped out onto the back patio. Morning light was broad and unforgiving, now falling directly on the gouge Nadia had raked into his window frame. Gerald lowered himself beside the contaminated water tank. There was no room in him for the shock his body wanted to feel. Cold mechanics. That was all this was. He located the heavy pipe wrench and the steel cutters in his toolbox and got to work. The main municipal valve at the property line went off first. Then he meticulously severed the inlet and outlet pipes connecting the poisoned aeration drum to his household plumbing, disconnecting the tainted unit completely, and rerouting the clean municipal feed straight into the house intake sealed tight with heavy brass fittings. By the time the bypass was finished, his hands were raw, bruised, and black with mud. He hauled the severed filtration tank into the locked garage and stood it against the wall. What had been a piece of home infrastructure was now something else, entirely a primary exhibit. Back inside, he twisted the kitchen faucet open wide. 20 minutes of running water to drive out any trace of the sedative still coating the internal pipes. Then he filled a glass, raised it, and drank. His thoughts were razor-edged. His body was clean. Every drop of what they had laid for him had gone nowhere near him. He had cut off their delivery mechanism before it could reach his lips. Gerald placed the empty glass on the granite counter. The red indicator on the kitchen landline was blinking at him. Slow, steady. He pressed playback. The system announced an incoming message from 10 minutes ago. Derek's voice came through the speaker. What followed was a performance of extraordinary craft. There was no edge of arrogance in Derek's tone, no demand, no threat. He sounded wrecked, a son coming apart at the seams over a father he could not reach. Each syllable arrived wrapped in a calculated tremor, designed to register as grief. Dad, we are so incredibly worried about you. You have been acting so strangely lately. You have been erratic and forgetful, and you are saying things that do not make any sense. Nadia and I love you too much to watch you deteriorate like this. We cannot let you suffer alone. We are coming over this afternoon. And Dad, we are bringing a behavioral specialist with us. Just someone to talk to you. Someone to help us figure out why you are losing your memory. Please just stay in the house and rest. We are coming to take care of you. The line went dead. The silence afterward pressed against the walls. Gerald did not move. The brazenness of it was almost architectural in its scale. Derek had not recorded that message for Gerald. He had recorded it for a courtroom. Every hesitation, every catch in his voice was a brick in a legal structure, a portrait of the anguished devoted son watching helplessly as his father collapsed. Gerald laid the full diagram of their operation out in his mind. The design was elegant and merciless. Derek had taken the smartphone first, cutting Gerald off from his accounts, then using that access to send a fraudulent email to a behavioral health clinic in Columbus, Ohio, establishing a paper trail of cognitive crisis before a single symptom existed. Then Nadia had introduced the sedative into the water supply, tasked with manufacturing in Gerald's actual body the precise deterioration Derek had already described on paper. The third stage was the arrest. They would show up at the house with a carefully chosen care professional in tow. Someone corrupt, someone naive, someone who would see what they needed them to see. They expected to find Gerald wandering his own living room, glassy-eyed and incoherent name gone from his memory. The consultant would observe the chemically induced condition and issue an emergency medical hold on the spot. With that document signed, the power of attorney Derek carried would lock into place. with total authority. Every financial institution would treat Derek as the legal steward of an incapacitated adult. The irrevocable trust Gerald had executed that same morning was a wrinkle, but an emergency conservatorship would give Derek grounds to drag it into litigation. Gerald would be transferred to a locked memory care unit where every accusation of poisoning he made would be catalogued as a symptom of his condition. Sedated and warehoused, he would remain there until he was gone, while his estate was quietly dismantled to cover their debts. Elegant, devastating, complete. They had motive legal instruments and a chemical weapon already deployed. Right now they were in a car headed toward his home, riding the certainty of people who have already won. They pictured a controlled scene, a confused old man sitting in the wreckage of his own mind, ready to be collected. Their whole structure, though, was built on one load-bearing assumption, that he had been drinking the water. Gerald turned his eyes down to his own hands, resting still and steady on his knees. No tremor, no fog. His mind moved with the kind of clarity that comes from outrunning something catastrophic by a matter of hours. He was not their sedated, pliable victim. He was holding a notarized archive of cognitive assessments, a certified toxicology finding, and high-definition video documenting the poisoning attempt in its entirety. He rose and walked toward the living room to begin setting the stage for what came next. The predators were driving toward what they believed was a ghost, and they were about to discover a fortified bunker instead. Gerald positioned himself at the center of the living room. On any ordinary day, the space offered warmth and stillness. Afternoon light, across comfortable furniture, a room built for rest. He did not see it that way this morning. He read it the way a commander reads terrain before an engagement. The environment had to be reshaped to match the scene Derek had scripted. Gerald gripped the edge of the heavy oak coffee table and shifted it several inches out of alignment. Wrong. The room needed to feel subtly, unmistakably wrong. He rotated his leather armchair so it pointed straight at the front door. Anyone stepping into the entryway would look directly at whoever sat in it. That was intentional. Gerald wanted Derek and Nadia to see him the instant the door swung open, planted in the chair, like a man waiting without knowing what he was waiting for. He gathered the throw pillows from the sofa and dropped them across the cushions without any order or arrangement. A woven wool blanket came out of the storage basket next, draped crookedly over the armrest rather than folded. Every element misplaced just enough. He crossed to the wooden magazine rack and tipped the stack of old publications onto the floor. Glossy pages spread themselves across the intricate patterns of the Turkish rug in a slow spreading fan. Each small act of disorder was a deliberate lure. Derek would enter that room scanning for evidence of collapse. Gerald intended to supply it in abundance, an immaculate simulation of the wreckage Derek had fabricated on paper. But no performance survives without a record. Gerald snapped open his heavy leather briefcase and removed 3 compact black devices, high-definition digital surveillance cameras. Not the entry-level consumer units Derek had once condescendingly told him to look into for basic home security. These were instruments of a different category, entirely commercial-grade optics. The same class deployed in major transit facilities, engineered to extract clean footage, and read the micro-expressions of a human face in conditions of near-total darkness. Gerald carried a sturdy wooden dining chair to the center of the room and stepped up onto the seat. He reached toward the ceiling and began removing the plastic housing from the smoke detector mounted on the southern wall. The first camera went in deep, wedged into the hollow cavity, at an angle that swept the whole living room and the front hallway in a single unbroken frame. He climbed down and crossed to the tall mahogany bookshelf near the corridor. From the middle shelf he drew out an old and thick atlas one, whose dense spine he had previously hollowed out, to create a perfect hiding spot. The second lens went inside the binding, the book angled so its eye would fall on the entryway. That camera's job was to record the unguarded faces of his attackers the instant they walked in. It would preserve in permanent evidence every trace of the arrogant certainty they intended to bring through that door. Gerald moved to the stone mantel above the brick fireplace and set the third and final camera directly behind, a brass-framed photograph of his late wife. Miriam had been the beating moral center of this family. That spot was right and earned. Her image would stand as a silent witness to the ruin of the son who had turned his back on everything she built. Gerald fished his prepaid mobile phone from his trouser pocket and opened the secure surveillance application. All three feeds came alive on the screen, sharp steady, without a single dropped frame. The audio pickups caught the low hum of the central air conditioning with clinical precision. He entered a complex string of command codes and pushed the live feeds through an encrypted tunnel, routing everything to a secure cloud server his attorney alone controlled. He dialed the lawyer. Clifton picked up immediately, confirming that the video and audio were arriving clean with zero latency. Clifton added that a certified legal stenographer was seated right beside him in his office in the Columbus downtown legal corridor near Capitol Square. Every syllable spoken in that living room would be transcribed into the official court record. The cage they were building had no gaps in it. Derek and Nadia were walking into a space wired from floor to ceiling, and every fabrication, every practiced manipulation would be captured in real time by an officer of the court. Gerald thanked him and put the phone down. The net was live, invisible. He walked back to the kitchen and gave the main sink a wide berth. The contaminated pipes behind those walls were dead to him now. He went to the dry pantry instead and pulled a sealed plastic bottle of pure spring water from the shelf. He cracked the tamper seal and held the cap as it snapped open clean and sharp, a sound that carried its own kind of satisfaction. He filled a heavy crystal glass with the clear, untainted water and carried it back to the living room, setting it directly in the center of the displaced oak coffee table. An unremarkable object by any measure. But to Gerald, it held the full weight of what was coming. Derek and Nadia were certain his bloodstream was already thick with a heavy industrial sedative. In their minds, his thoughts were unraveling, his grip on reality coming loose around the edges. They expected to find him clutching at nothing, unable to string a sentence together. That glass of pristine, filtered water sitting on the table was his opening statement of war. His head was clear. His mind was a sealed room nothing could breach. He lowered himself into the angled leather armchair. He raised the crystal glass and drank slowly, deliberately. The cold water cut through the tension in his chest and brought everything into sharper relief. He had never been more prepared for anything in his life. One last reach into the leather briefcase at his side, and he brought out the thick manila folder that held the foundational legal record of his entire existence. The original deed to the house came out first, heavy parchment. The ink faded, but the signatures were still legible, both Gerald's and Miriam's. She had loved this house in a way that went past sentiment. The mature maple trees providing shade in the front yard were ones Miriam had personally planted. The color of the kitchen cabinets had been her decision made after weeks of deliberation. Derek intended to rip that home out of her memory and sell it off to clear his reckless corporate debts. Gerald's eyes moved to the crisp addendum stapled to the face of that weathered deed, the official court confirmation of the irrevocable trust transfer. Clifton had put the entire stack of paperwork before the county clerk within minutes of their first call that morning. Every legal protection was now locked in and verified. The house, the land, the retirement accounts, none of it belonged to Gerald anymore. It all sat inside a faceless and impenetrable corporate structure that Gerald directed, but did not technically possess. Derek held a fraudulent power of attorney, giving him authority over his father's personal assets. The problem was that Gerald now had absolutely zero personal assets for anyone to touch. The blind trust had consumed the estate completely. Derek was about to walk in here and wave that document around like a weapon, not knowing it was already worthless. He was going to make demands on a financial empire that no longer existed. Gerald slid the folder back into the briefcase and pushed it deep beneath the armchair, out of any line of sight. He glanced at his stainless steel wristwatch. Everything was in position. The cameras were running without a sound. The water was clean. The deed was untouchable behind a wall of ironclad law. Gerald settled back and let his hands rest loosely folded in his lap. His gaze held steady on the heavy wooden front door. The antique mantel clock resting on the hallway shelf measured the quiet in slow, even beats. He let the stillness settle around him and waited for everything he had built toward to finally arrive. Then the heavy brass tumblers of the front lock turned with a hard metallic crack. Gerald didn't shift so much as a finger. He sat motionless and tracked the footsteps coming across the foyer's hardwood. 3 separate gates, 3 distinct sets of shoes. Derek and Nadia had brought company. Their voices were low and tight, crowding the hallway. Derek was giving someone instructions, catalog the environmental hazards, record any indicators of physical neglect. Nadia was briefing the third person the subject had almost certainly taken on a heavy dose of medication and might come in swinging, or might not respond at all. They were constructing their story out in the hallway, rehearsing every lie they planned to write into the medical record as justification for what they were stealing. Derek came around the corner into the living room ahead of the others. His face was arranged with great care into an expression of deep, sorrowful concern. He had walked in prepared to find his father adrift in soiled clothes, or face down across the coffee table in a chemical stupor. He stepped onto the Turkish rug and pulled up so hard that Nadia walked straight into his back. That mask of grief he'd constructed simply fell away. In its place was a stare of raw, uncomprehending shock. Gerald was not in pajamas. He was not in a cardigan. He was wearing a tailored navy wool suit, the very suit he had put on during the most savage corporate acquisitions of his career. His tie sat in a precise knot. His spine was a straight line. The heavy crystal glass of pristine, filtered water rested against his knee. The afternoon light crossed his face and found eyes that held nothing soft, just focus and cold calculation and absolute readiness. All around him the room told the story he had staged. Magazines thrown furniture pushed out of place the deliberate suggestion of chaos. And in the middle of all of it sat this man, immaculate, composed, and radiating something that could only be described as dangerous. Nadia moved out from behind her husband. Her gaze went straight to the glass in Gerald's hand. She stared at the clear liquid, and her fingers shook a visible, involuntary tremor. She had measured out exactly how much heavy sedative went into the external filtration tank only hours ago. She had come here expecting to find a comatose victim struggling to breathe. What she found instead was a predator, still watchful, taking the measure of his prey from the center of his own domain. Derek swallowed. The silence in the room pressed in and would not relent. His eyes moved across the scattered magazines, the displaced furniture. He fought to hold the story together, the one he'd spent so long building. He cleared his throat, and the crack in his voice was audible. He said they had driven straight over out of sheer terror at his erratic behavior, that walking in to find the front door unsecured and the living room torn apart made it absolutely clear how much his father required professional help. Then the third figure came through into the room, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the suit that announced money, but somehow felt hollow underneath. He kept a thick leather portfolio pressed under one arm. Nothing about the way he held himself suggested the steadiness of an actual clinician. He moved the way a debt enforcer moves, ownership baked into every step. Derek made the introduction without hesitation. Before I tell you what was about to unfold in that living room and exactly what it would cost the people who believed they had already won, I want to ask you this: if you discovered someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them immediately, or would you wait until every piece of proof was locked and loaded? Derek introduced the man as a senior care consultant named Greer. He claimed Greer was an independent specialist they had retained to assess the living conditions and confirmed that Gerald was receiving the highest standard of cognitive support. Gerald placed the type the instant he saw him. 40 years in the freight industry had sharpened his eye for hired guns. Greer was no doctor. He was an unlicensed facilitator, a professional rubber stamp employed by predatory families to manufacture grounds for involuntary commitment. His whole operation depended on elderly targets being frightened, disoriented, and too overwhelmed to mount a legal defense. Greer didn't bother asking permission to enter the space. He walked straight toward Gerald and planted himself inches from the edge of the oak coffee table. He looked down with a practiced, deeply condescending smile and shifted into a slow, exaggerated register, the kind of voice ordinarily reserved for very small children. He told Gerald there was nothing to be frightened of. He said they were all there to help him through this confusing period and get him somewhere safe. He drew a silver pen from his breast pocket and flipped open the leather portfolio. He said he only needed to run through a few straightforward questions to establish a basic cognitive baseline before they made arrangements for transport. Gerald raised the crystal glass and took a measured, unhurried sip. He set it back on the table. The sharp clink it made against the surface rang out through the silence of the room. He brought his gaze up to meet the consultant's eyes. No raised voice, no visible emotion, just the cold and flattening authority of a man who had spent a career commanding rooms. Gerald asked Greer to state his full legal name and his primary medical license number for the official record. The smile on the consultant's face faltered a brief but telling crack. Greer pivoted at once. He brushed the request aside entirely and asked Gerald if he could recall what day of the week it was. He asked whether Gerald remembered the name of the sitting president, and whether the state of the living room was making him feel disoriented. He was working to dominate the exchange, to recast Gerald as a hostile and bewildered patient, and seize control of the room's rhythm. Gerald let it land without reaction. He shifted slightly forward in the leather armchair. He put the demand back on the table with a harder and more deliberate edge. He said that before he submitted to an unannounced evaluation inside his own home, he expected the evaluating party to produce a board-certified medical credential. He asked Greer directly, was he a licensed psychiatrist, a licensed neurologist, or simply a private contractor? Operating without a single shred of clinical authority, Greer's weight shifted. He looked back over his shoulder at Derek. Derek stepped forward, and his face colored with sudden unsteady anger. He leveled a shaking finger at his father. He shouted that this kind of aggressive paranoia was exactly the reason they'd brought help. He claimed Gerald was manufacturing threats out of thin air and refusing care that was clearly necessary. He demanded his father stop resisting and answer the questions, or they would have no choice but to call an ambulance and have him removed from the property by force. Gerald turned away from the consultant and fixed his eyes on his son. He clocked the sweat gathered on Derek's brow. He saw Nadia's frantic, calculating look as she drifted toward the hallway. The entire architecture of their scheme was buckling because the central premise was wrong. They had walked in rehearsed for a sedated, compliant target. They had no playbook for someone fully alert, fully armed and waiting for them. Gerald told his son calmly and without inflection that no ambulance was coming. He explained that Columbus Emergency Dispatch required either a physical medical emergency or an active violent mental health crisis to authorize an involuntary hold. He was seated in his own home, unmoving, conducting a rational legal inquiry into the credentials of an uninvited guest. If Derek called emergency services at this moment, the officers who responded would not encounter a confused, helpless old man. They would encounter 3 individuals attempting to coerce a mentally competent adult, and that distinction would follow all 3 of them into a courtroom. The temperature in the room climbed past the point of recovery. The precision of Gerald's argument tore through the fabricated scenario they had rehearsed. Greer snapped his leather portfolio shut with a dull, flat sound and took a deliberate step back toward the foyer. The easy payout he had been promised was turning rapidly into a serious legal exposure. He could see that the man in the armchair was not manifesting any symptom of cognitive deterioration. He was manifesting something else entirely, the methodical patience of someone who had already set his trap and was simply waiting for them to step into it. Nadia spoke. Her voice arrived thin and strained panic, pulling at the edges of it. She demanded to know why Gerald was behaving so strangely, why he was sitting in a formal suit on a Saturday afternoon in the middle of all of this. She tried to drag the conversation back toward his alleged erratic conduct. She pointed at the scattered magazines and the displaced furniture, insisting that no person in their right mind kept a home in such bizarre and chaotic conditions. Gerald did not glance at the mess he had staged with great care. His eyes stayed fixed on Nadia. He informed her that the room was being recorded by 3 high-definition surveillance cameras, and he named their exact positions, with a precision that was quietly devastating. He directed her attention to the hollowed spine of the atlas on the bookshelf. He gestured toward the smoke detector mounted on the southern wall. He gave a single nod toward the brass-framed photograph of his late wife resting on the stone mantel. He told her that audio and visual feeds were transmitting in real time to a secure cloud server, one being actively monitored by his legal counsel and a certified court stenographer. He watched what little color remained in Nadia's face, drained completely away as the reality of her position came into full, terrible focus. She understood in that moment that her entry through the back window and her deliberate contamination of the water supply were almost certainly on record. Gerald rose from the armchair. He smoothed the front of his suit jacket and walked toward his son at an unhurried pace. The balance of power in that room had reversed entirely and without any drama. He was no longer a target waiting to be collected. He was the man who had designed every corner of this situation. He stopped in front of Derek and asked evenly whether he genuinely wished to continue the medical evaluation. He offered to contact his attorney and have the certified reports from his neurology clinics across Columbus, Ohio, delivered to the house within the hour, so the unlicensed consultant could review them personally. He watched Derek physically shrink as the full weight of what had been assembled against him pressed down and snuffed out the last of his confidence. Greer, for his part, had moved deeper into the room with the practiced ease of a man who expected submission as a matter of course. He hadn't asked to sit. He simply dropped himself onto the plush sofa across from the coffee table, unbuttoned his cheap suit jacket, and opened the leather portfolio across his knees. He clicked the silver pen twice. The sound was crisp and precise in the heavy quiet. Greer didn't regard Gerald as a person withstanding in the room. He regarded him as an asset that had already been subdued, something to be processed and signed over. He crossed his legs, leaned in, and began. His voice was loud and mechanically slow, each syllable carved out as though he were addressing someone with a profound cognitive impairment. He asked Gerald to state his full legal name. He asked him to name the city he was in and the current season. He did not wait for any answer to settle before he moved forward. He stacked a second question on top of the first, and a third on top of that. What had Gerald eaten for breakfast? And then before that, had anywhere to land? What was the date of his late wife's passing? It was a predatory technique entirely deliberate. Greer was engineering cognitive overload. He wanted Gerald to stumble, to lose the thread, to show visible frustration. If Gerald became agitated, Greer would note dangerous emotional volatility. If Gerald went quiet, Greer would note severe, unresponsive catatonia. Gerald said nothing. He sat still in his tailored navy wool suit, his breathing even and unhurried, and he studied the cheap fabric of the consultant's jacket and the performative flourishes of his hands. The silence in the room deepened and refused to lift. Greer tried again. He leaned closer and aimed the silver pen at the magazines strewn across the Turkish rug. He asked Gerald why the house had been allowed to fall into such a state. He asked whether Gerald was struggling to keep up with basic household tasks, whether it was a matter of forgetting or simply running out of the physical capacity to manage. Gerald watched him. His expression offered nothing at all. He was holding up a blank surface and letting them paint their own exposure directly onto it. He knew the 3 hidden cameras were capturing every second of this fraudulent medical performance. Nadia decided the moment had come to turn up the emotional heat. She stepped forward and buried her face in her hands. A series of dramatic, wholly manufactured sobs filled the quiet room. She squeezed out a few desperate tears. She turned to Greer and began narrating her invented tragedy. She claimed that watching her father-in-law's rapid mental deterioration was tearing their family to pieces. She told the consultant that Gerald had once been such a formidable and capable man, but now he was utterly lost inside his own mind. She lied with a fluency that was genuinely chilling. She spun out fabricated wandering episodes, all supposedly occurring within the past month. She described incidents in which Gerald had allegedly forgotten his own son's name and turned physically violent. She leveled a manicured finger at the glass of pure spring water on the coffee table. She told Greer that Gerald had stopped eating and drinking properly because he was gripped by severe paranoid delusions. She claimed Gerald genuinely believed his own family was poisoning his food. The irony of that statement settled over the room like a weight. Nadia was standing there and performing outrage about paranoid delusions involving contaminated water, while at that very moment an empty dark glass vial sat deep in the pocket of her trench coat. Gerald simply watched her work. He did not blink. Not a flicker of indignation crossed his face. He gave her the space to construct the most elaborate perjury she was capable of. He took quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that the certified court stenographer, connected to the secure cloud server, was transcribing every fabricated detail into the permanent legal record. Nadia pressed a knuckle against her cheek to blot a counterfeit tear. She begged Greer to help them. She pleaded with the consultant to authorize the emergency medical hold before Gerald harmed himself or someone else. Derek moved in to close the trap. He crossed to the coffee table and positioned himself directly in front of his father. His hand went into the inner pocket of his jacket. He drew out a dense stack of legal documents, the pages crisp, unfolded, freshly printed. Derek brought them down hard onto the oak surface, right beside the heavy crystal glass of pristine filtered water. He pressed his index finger onto the top page. He told his father they had arrived at the absolute end of the road. He insisted the family could no longer go on pretending things were fine, while Gerald fell apart in front of them. He announced that the document on the table was a voluntary emergency conservatorship agreement, one that would legally hand all medical and financial authority directly to him. Derek's tone was soaked in a toxic, suffocating brand of pity. He told Gerald that signing was the only path that avoided a humiliating and very public court battle. He bent over the table and dropped his voice to something between a whisper and a threat. He told Gerald that if he refused to put his name on those papers, Greer would certify him on the spot as an active danger to himself and others. Derek promised an ambulance would be at the door within 10 minutes to take him away by force. He threatened a secure psychiatric ward where Gerald would be stripped of his clothing and kept heavily sedated until he gave in. He said the doctors there would not give a moment's consideration to the ramblings of a senile old man. Derek pushed a heavy black pen across the table. It came to rest beside the thick stack of documents. He told Gerald to surrender his autonomy right now for his own sake. He told his father the fight was finished and it was time to let the family step in. Gerald looked at the black pen lying on the table. He looked at the conservatorship papers piled next to it. He looked at his son's face flushed with the anticipation of a man who believed he had already won. Derek was certain the heavy sedative Nadia had poured into the water tank had burned through what he was feeding them the rope. He waited while they ran through every remaining line of their malicious script. He waited until every threat of forced confinement and every invented symptom had been locked permanently into the digital record on the cloud server. The extortion attempt was now an undeniable matter of documented fact. The trap Derek had so carefully assembled had sprung, and the arrogant son had no idea whatsoever that he was the one caged inside it. The silence stretched until it became something almost physical, a pressure the intruders could feel against their ribs. Gerald looked at the black pen on the coffee table. He looked at the stack of fraudulent conservatorship papers. He reached for neither. The time for letting them perform had run its course. They had delivered their full script into the legal record. Gerald reached down beside the armchair, his hand passed the glass of pure spring water, and closed around the worn handle of his leather briefcase. He lifted it onto his lap and worked the brass clasps open. The metallic snap made Nadia flinch. Gerald withdrew a thick leather-bound folder, set the briefcase back on the floor, and looked directly at his son. He slid the folder across the coffee table's surface. It came to rest right beside the black pen Derek had offered him. Gerald spoke the first words he had chosen to say in several minutes. His voice was not the frail or muddled thing they had come expecting. It was cold, low, and resonant, the kind of voice that drops the temperature of a room. He told Derek that the medical evaluation was officially over. He turned his attention to the unlicensed consultant on the sofa. He told Greer to open the leather folder and read the top documents aloud. Greer hesitated. He looked to Derek for guidance, but Derek was staring at his father with an expression of pure bewilderment. The sheer authority in Gerald's voice left Greer with no reasonable path but compliance. The consultant leaned in and opened the heavy cover. He looked at the crisp white pages on top of the stack. Gerald walked him through exactly what he was holding. 3 independent comprehensive neurological evaluations conducted only hours earlier that same morning by 3 separate board-certified specialists. Gerald directed Greer's attention to the time-stamped headers and the embossed notary seals on each report. He told Greer to read the medical conclusions aloud. Greer's eyes moved down the page and his hands began to shake. The reports spoke in complete agreement. Gerald's mental health was entirely intact. His cognitive function was described as flawless. His spatial reasoning was exceptional. There was no trace of dementia, no paranoia, no sign of decline of any kind. The blood left the consultant's face entirely. A grayish pallor took its place as the full scope of the legal catastrophe he had walked into came into focus. Greer had just been recorded as an active participant in a coordinated criminal conspiracy. He had attempted to coerce a perfectly healthy and highly intelligent man into a fraudulent medical conservatorship. Sweat broke out across his forehead. The silver pen slipped from his fingers and struck the hardwood floor with a clatter. He attempted a stammering, hollow apology, insisting he had only been doing his job, acting entirely on the information the family had given him. Gerald cut him off without raising his voice, but with an edge that left no room for negotiation. He reminded Greer that attempting to rubber stamp a forced medical hold on a competent adult constituted a serious felony. He noted again that every word of this conversation was streaming live to a legal server monitored by a court stenographer. Greer sank back into the sofa cushions, understanding that his career and his liberty had just been extinguished in a single afternoon. Derek refused to accept what was unfolding in front of him. He drove his palm down on the coffee table and shouted that the documents were forgeries. He accused his father of bribing corrupt doctors to mask his deterioration. He pointed at Gerald and insisted the erratic behavior was plain for anyone to see they were not walking out without a signed conservatorship. Derek was clinging to the script because it was the only thing he had left. His entire financial survival had been staked on this one predatory gambit, and he had nothing to fall back on. Nadia stood frozen near the hallway entrance. Her eyes moved rapidly around the room as the reality of absolute defeat began slowly and irreversibly to take hold. Gerald ignored his son's shouting. He reached calmly across the table and turned the neurological reports face down, revealing the next layer of his counter-offensive beneath. From the leather folder, Gerald withdrew a sealed laboratory envelope and set it deliberately on the table in front of Derek. The document, he announced, was a certified toxicology report rushed through that very morning by a private independent testing facility. Derek's shouting cut off the moment the envelope landed. He stood there staring at it, a cold dread spreading through him like ice water. Gerald had no intention of waiting for his son to break the seal. He told them both precisely what the technicians had uncovered. He walked them through the heavy industrial sedative with clinical, methodical precision. The specific neurological damage the compound was engineered to inflict on the human body, the way it shattered memory and destroyed spatial orientation at the neurological level. What made it worse, he told Derek, was that this drug had been purpose-built to replicate the exact symptoms described in the fraudulent email dispatched to the behavioral health clinic in Columbus, Ohio. The whole poisonous design of their ambush was now exposed and naked under the light. Across the room, Nadia's breath caught and broke into a sharp, involuntary sound. Her body lurched a half-step back. Both hands trembled as she pressed them flat against the fabric of her designer trench coat. Her eyes went to the heavy oak front door, the desperation of someone calculating an exit. Gerald pivoted his gaze onto her slow and without mercy. He told Nadia that the laboratory had traced the exact chemical compound back to a water sample he had gathered himself pulled directly from the external filtration unit at Gerald's home in a quiet suburb of Columbus, Ohio, in the minutes immediately following her visit to his backyard. Then he reached in and struck the killing blow of the entire operation. One final time, his hand went into the leather folder. What came out was a dense stack of high-definition, glossy photographs, which he released onto the table with a casual flick. They fanned across the polished surface in a wide arc. The resolution was flawless. There was nothing ambiguous in a single frame. The early shots showed Nadia moving through the backyard's morning mist, low and deliberate. Others captured her fingers wrapped around a steel screwdriver as she worked at the study window, trying to force it open. Gerald set his finger on the most incriminating image at the center of the spread, Nadia positioned directly beside the water filtration tank, the unmarked dark glass vial tilted over the open aeration grate. A fine white powder hung suspended in the air above the grate, descending in silence toward the household's main drinking supply. Gerald told them he had stood and watched from the shadows inside his kitchen while it happened. Every moment of her trespassing, every act of poisoning, he said, had been captured in full by his backup camera. That realization, total, irreversible defeat, came down on Derek and Nadia at once. Every trace of manufactured grief fell away from his daughter-in-law's face. What it left behind was pure, unguarded terror. She was looking at photographs of herself in the act of committing a serious, premeditated felony. Derek's gaze moved from the images to the crystal glass of filtered water sitting near his father. Something fundamental collapsed behind his eyes. His father hadn't touched the poison supply. Gerald had been sharp, deliberate, and fully alert the entire morning, constructing an airtight criminal case while they played their game around him. Gerald surveyed the two terrified figures rooted to the floor of his living room. He told them they had walked into this house with one purpose: to erase his autonomy, his dignity, and his freedom. They had meant to trap him inside a chemical fog, he said, so they could quietly pick apart 40 years of accumulated wealth. His body leaned forward. His voice fell to something just above silence. They had failed, he told them. The trap had closed, and it would not open again. He remained at the center of the room without moving. His voice stayed even. Volume was unnecessary. The room already belonged entirely to him. He let the silence build and press down, letting it do the work of amplifying the terror written across his sons' and daughter-in-law's faces. He took in the glossy photographs spread across the oak coffee table. He took in the certified medical assessments, confirming his complete cognitive clarity. Then his gaze moved cold and without a flicker to settle on Nadia. When he spoke, his words carried the deliberate final weight of a verdict being read from the bench. He told her that covertly obtaining a heavy industrial sedative and introducing it into the drinking supply of a private home was not the kind of thing a family settled with a difficult conversation. Law enforcement, he explained, categorized as premeditated, aggravated assault. Targeting an elderly person specifically, he continued triggered automatic sentencing enhancements written into state law. He watched her legs go slightly unsteady as the genuine magnitude of what she had done punctured through the shell of her self-assurance. The role of clever suburban strategist was gone. She was a criminal now, and the timeline ahead of her was measured in decades behind bars. Gerald moved his gaze to Derek. He told his son that engineering a fraudulent conservatorship to seize assets built over a lifetime had a precise legal name: elder financial abuse. And the moment Derek used electronic networks to pose as him and contact a psychiatric facility, the offense compounded. Routing extortion and medical fraud through interstate digital infrastructure, Gerald informed them transformed their scheme into a federal matter. There was no civil dispute to negotiate here. They had walked themselves directly into federal jurisdiction. A hollow sound escaped Nadia, breathless, gutted. She retreated from the coffee table in lurching steps as though the documents on its surface radiated heat. Her eyes moved in rapid, frantic arcs across the walls and up toward the ceiling. Gerald raised one hand, measured and slow, and directed it at the smoke detector, fixed high on the wall above them. He then indicated the atlas on the mahogany bookshelf, its dense spine hollowed out. He gestured toward the brass frame holding the photograph of his late wife, resting on the stone mantel. Everything they had said, he reminded them, every threat, every fabricated symptom had been feeding in real time to a secured digital archive. The trap, he made plain, was not a future threat. It had already closed. Clifton, he told Derek, was not simply holding high-definition surveillance footage in reserve for some eventual court appearance. Clifton was at that moment in his office in the Columbus downtown legal corridor, near Capitol Square, maintaining an open live connection with the local district attorney. The full dossier, Gerald told his son, had already been delivered. The certified toxicology report establishing the sedative's presence, the photographs documenting Nadia's tampering at the filtration unit, those materials were already on a federal prosecutor's desk. The criminal complaint was filed, he stated. It was already in motion. Nothing Derek said, nothing he attempted would slow it down by a single hour. Across the room, the unlicensed care consultant named Greer went rigid and made a strangled choking sound. Every trace of the predatory arrogance he had hauled through the front door dissolved on contact with reality. Greer operated as a mercenary. He preyed on disoriented, chemically compromised targets who couldn't fight back. A carefully laid trap sprung by a man of Gerald's caliber was something Greer had no framework for handling. With dawning horror, he understood that his own words were already part of the recording, permanently archived, impossible to retract. He had been caught on camera working to coerce a healthy man into a fraudulent medical lockup. His fingerprints were on a federal extortion conspiracy, and those fingerprints were now in the district attorney's possession. Greer didn't reach for an explanation. He didn't bother with an apology directed at Gerald. Instead, he backpedaled with the wild, graceless urgency of something trying to escape a trap already shut around it. His retreat carried him hard into the sofa, and his footing nearly went out from under him on the Turkish rug. He hauled his leather portfolio against his chest like a shield and drove himself toward the foyer. The people who had paid him, he left them without a backward glance. The front door hit its frame with a force that shook the picture frames from their positions along the hallway walls. Greer was out of the house, and Derek and Nadia were left standing alone in the ruin of everything they had constructed. Derek hadn't moved from the center of the room. He watched the man he had hired for medical cover sprint off the property in open, frantic flight. The sense of commanding control Derek had inhabited all morning, it was gone, broken apart completely. His wife stood nearby with both hands clamped over her mouth, her whole body working to contain the sound of her sobbing. He turned and looked at his father. The judgment in the old man's eyes was cold and absolute, the gaze of someone who had given everything to raise him and had now seen exactly what that produced. Understanding that he had lost entirely without any room for negotiation cut through the thick insulation of Derek's entitlement at last. But he was not capable of yielding to that understanding with any grace. He had crossed too many lines and burned too many connections, driven by a financial desperation that had become total. There is nothing in a room more volatile than a predator that has been cornered and has nothing left to lose. The blood came flooding back into Derek's face, hot and sudden. His face contorted into something ugly, pure unfiltered rage, with nothing beneath it but desperation. His fists clenched hard at his sides. He lunged a step toward his father, the photographs on the table beneath his notice entirely. He screamed that Gerald had no grasp of what was actually at stake. Sending him to a federal penitentiary, he shouted, would not preserve any precious family legacy. Derek jabbed a trembling finger toward the floor beneath their feet. The house they were standing in, he declared, was already gone. He hadn't waited for the conservatorship to begin dismantling the estate. He'd moved long before that. He had discovered a temporary financial authorization Gerald had signed years earlier for a minor medical procedure, and he'd held onto a digital copy of that signature. He used it to manufacture a secondary property authorization out of nothing. That fraudulent document, he screamed, had been the lever he used against the entire property. He had drawn a massive home equity line of credit directly against the house, $150. He hurled the number at the ceiling, and the room threw it back. He had burned through every dollar of it, covering the wreckage of his collapsing company. Derek pressed forward, breath sawing in and out of him. The corporate creditors were gone, he screamed, and the bank knew about the default. The grace period had expired. The final balloon payment was due right now. He fixed his father with a wild, cornered sneer. The bank, he said, was set to launch foreclosure proceedings first thing tomorrow morning. Everything Gerald and his late wife had ever built would be stripped away by collectors before the week was out. Then came his ultimatum, the most desperate card he had left to play. Gerald was the only one who could stop the bank from taking the house. Derek claimed he had a venture capital arrangement nearly finalized that would clear the debt outright, but he needed Gerald to execute the conservatorship papers immediately so he could access the bridge capital. Drop the criminal case, Derek demanded. Hand over legal control of himself right now. If Gerald sent his own son to federal prison, he screamed he'd be putting an old man out on the street. Derek was using the memory of his mother as a weapon, a final ruthless attempt to force unconditional surrender. He stood in the center of the living room, heaving for breath. His expensive suit hung on him disheveled from the effort of his outburst, his face blazing red. He was convinced he had just laid down a hand that couldn't be beaten. He had aimed straight at the thing his father held most sacred. He understood how deeply Gerald was bound to that house. Every room, every wall carried some piece of Miriam. Derek pushed further. He demanded Gerald's retirement accounts as well. The arithmetic, he said, was brutally simple. There was over $400,000 sitting in an index fund. Sign the medical conservatorship immediately, Derek told him, and he would use that money to settle the bank and pull the house back from foreclosure. He wrapped his naked extortion in the language of sacrifice, a tragic but necessary act of rescue. Pride, he told his father, was something neither of them could afford any more. Gerald did not shout back. He made no move to plead for the property. He reached forward, unhurried, and lifted the heavy crystal glass from the oak coffee table. The ice clinked softly against the thick glass. In the suffocating stillness of the room, the sound rang out clean and precise. Gerald brought the glass to his lips and took a slow, deliberate drink of the pure, filtered water. He set it down without rushing. He let the silence expand until it pressed in on his son from every direction. Derek couldn't stand silence. He needed his father frightened, or weeping, or bargaining. Gerald simply returned the glass to the table. He folded his hands in his lap and regarded the desperate figure in front of him. When he spoke, his voice carried no trace of anger and no trace of fear. He told Derek that his entire tactical framework was built on a flawed foundation. He was, Gerald said, attempting to hold hostage, something that no longer existed. He gestured toward the leather folder on the coffee table. He told Derek that these past several weeks had not been spent sitting idle. While they had been plotting, he had been quietly cutting every legal and financial connection between his own name and his accumulated assets, thread by thread, without leaving a loose end. He explained that days before Derek and Nadia had executed their chemical ambush, he had completed a sweeping transfer of property. Gerald watched the confidence begin to fall away from his son's face as he laid out the precise architecture of what he had built. The house and the land it occupied, he stated, had been absorbed into an irrevocable blind trust. A blind trust, he explained, functioned as an impenetrable legal structure governed by an independent board of directors and administered under the oversight of his attorney Clifton. Gerald no longer held any personal claim to the estate. The family home was sealed inside a fortress of corporate law. Derek had no leverage over property that Gerald didn't legally own. Beyond that, even a successful medical conservatorship over Gerald would deliver Derek exactly nothing, zero access to trust assets. The blind trust had been constructed specifically to foreclose any predatory approach to the family's wealth. Derek took a stumbling step back. The color drained out of his flushed face so completely that his skin went pale and almost translucent. He shook his head, muttering that it wasn't possible. The bank had already approved the credit line on the basis of his forged power of attorney. The funds had been deposited and spent. He kept insisting that the bank would still pursue the physical property to cover the shortfall. He was gripping the idea that his father remained in danger of losing the house, because letting go of that idea meant letting go of everything. Gerald didn't allow him that comfort. With surgical precision, he dismantled the last remaining piece of his son's strategy. Commercial banks, he told Derek, employed sophisticated fraud detection systems. When Clifton filed the deed transfer with the county clerk, the shift in ownership instantly set off a cascading security alert inside the banking system. The lending institution moved immediately to freeze every external credit protocol tied to that property address. The bank's risk management division flagged it without delay, a massive irregular withdrawal of $150,000 executed by a secondary signatory under highly suspicious circumstances. Gerald leaned forward from his leather armchair. He walked his son through what happened next. 3 days ago, a senior investigator from the bank's fraud division had come directly to Clifton's office. Clifton had laid out the documentation of the blind trust in full. He had also submitted a sworn and notarized affidavit from Gerald himself. That affidavit stated plainly that Gerald had never authorized any home equity line of credit. It confirmed that the signature on the loan application was a deliberate and calculated forgery. It demonstrated that Derek had accessed the collateral using an outdated medically restricted proxy form that he had no legal right to employ. A sharp, anguished sound escaped Nadia. She dropped onto the armrest of the sofa as though her legs had given way beneath her. She stared across the room at her husband with undisguised horror. The full scale of what they had done, the depth of the crater they had dug, landed on her all at once. They weren't walking away with an early inheritance. They were buried under a mountain of stolen money with nowhere left to run. She understood now that her marriage to Derek was no longer her pathway to a comfortable life in Dublin, Ohio. It was a chain binding her to a vessel going straight to the bottom, directly into a federal courtroom. Gerald went on, his voice steady and cold as iron. The bank, he told Derek, was not preparing to foreclose on this property tomorrow morning. The institution recognized that the underlying asset was held within a legally protected trust, entirely shielded from the fraudulent debt Derek had manufactured. The bank had simply reclassified the $150,000 line of credit. It was no longer recorded as a secured residential loan. It was now formally designated as a serious case of systemic identity theft. Derek began shaking a deep, uncontrolled tremor, his arms folding across his own chest, as though the room had gone cold around him. Gerald delivered the final, unavoidable fact. The bank held Derek personally and completely liable for every missing dollar. He was staring at a mountain of unsecured debt, with no means of repayment and no path of escape. Large financial institutions, Gerald explained, did not extend courtesies to people who forged documents to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars. They came after them with relentless, overwhelming legal force. Gerald watched his son come apart entirely. The bluster and the calculated threats had evaporated without a trace. Derek was at last confronting the true price of his own boundless arrogance. Gerald told him that the bank's legal division had already bypassed the standard collection channels. They had forwarded the complete financial dossier, forged signatures, and all directly to the Commercial Crimes Unit. Felony charges were being actively prepared, Gerald stated. The indictments taking shape were for grand larceny, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. He sat without moving and took in the total collapse of the predators who had walked into his home. He hadn't raised a hand. He had simply turned the vast machinery of law and finance against them and let it run. He told Derek that the people arriving tomorrow morning were not debt collectors coming for the house. They were federal marshals coming with handcuffs. The heavy front door stayed shut. The violent crash of Greer's exit still seemed to hang in the dead air of the living room. Derek and Nadia stood rooted to the Turkish rug, neither of them capable of movement. What followed was a silence so absolute it pressed down on the room like a physical weight. It was the silence of a world caving in. The polished suburban life they had erected on a scaffold of deception and stolen funds was dissolving under their feet in real time. Derek stared blankly at the empty chair where his hired consultant had been sitting moments before. His chest moved in quick, shallow bursts. He had moved through his entire adult life, convinced he was the most capable person in any room he entered. He had genuinely calculated that he could run circles around commercial banks, stay a step ahead of federal investigators, and bend the father who had raised him to his will. Now he was looking directly into the open mouth of his own destruction. Nadia broke first. The careful performance of the loving, worried daughter-in-law split apart all at once. The manufactured tears from minutes earlier were gone without a remnant. What replaced them was a wild animal panic that rearranged her face into something stripped of pretense, nothing but raw survival instinct. She turned her head slowly toward her husband. What her eyes held bore no resemblance to love or loyalty. It was the gaze of something caged, looking for another body to put between itself and the threat. She stepped away from Derek as though closeness to him might somehow attach his criminal exposure to her. Her finger came up shaking, aimed at his chest, and her voice split into a high, fractured shriek. This was entirely his fault, she screamed. She had never wanted to go this far. He had dragged her into this conspiracy against her better judgment. The unified front they had carried through the front door was gone in an instant. The weight of the incoming indictments had converted them into vicious opponents. Nadia demanded to know how Derek could have been so catastrophically reckless. He had told her the plan was airtight. He had promised that the forged power of attorney would unlock immediate access to the retirement accounts. He had assured her that introducing the compound into the water supply would produce a quiet, traceless medical intervention. Now she was face to face with high-definition photographs of herself in the middle of committing a serious felony. She was not going to federal prison, she screamed, because of his failing startup. Nadia moved in frantic circuits across the hardwood floor. The sharp, erratic click of her designer heels punctuated her unraveling. She dismantled the pretense of their marriage out loud piece by piece. Derek had bled them to nothing, funding a software company that was a hollow shell, she shouted. She had known for months he was drowning in debt, and for months he had fed her one false story after another about new investors waiting in the wings. He was a failure who had pulled her into a federal extortion plot rather than face the fact that he had already lost everything. She turned to Gerald and pleaded for him to see that she was a victim of her husband's manipulation. She begged him to believe that Derek had coerced her into sourcing the industrial sedative and contaminating the water tank. She was serving her husband up as the sole architect of the conspiracy, offering him as a sacrifice in exchange for her own escape. Derek could not absorb the assault. He spun on Nadia and screamed at her to stop talking immediately. His voice fractured under the pressure, the sound of a cornered man with nothing left. She was just as culpable as he was, he yelled. She had been more than happy to spend the money drawn from the fraudulent credit line. She was the one who had researched the sedative's specific neurological effects and worked out the precise dosage required to produce the cognitive delirium. Federal prosecutors, he told her, would not be moved by her explanations when the surveillance footage showed her leaning over the water tank. They were destroying each other in the center of the living room. Every bitter exchange stripped another layer back, exposing the rot that had always been at the foundation of what they called a marriage. Gerald sat in his leather armchair and observed the partnership consuming itself. He made no move to intervene. He let them lay out their mutual guilt and their mutual contempt in full, all of it feeding into the permanent audio record running in the room. When the shouting finally burned itself out, a heavy, defeated quiet settled over everything. The adrenaline bled away and left only the cold, immovable facts of their position. Derek turned back to face his father. The intimidating posture, the swagger, the aggression, all of it was gone. The predator who had entered that house had ceased to exist. What stood in his place was a frightened and broken person who had finally grasped that there was nobody left to absorb the consequences for him. His shoulders folded forward, and his hands trembled badly at his sides. He moved toward the oak coffee table in a hesitant, uncertain step. He looked at the leather folder containing the irrevocable trust documents and the certified toxicology report. He raised his eyes to Gerald, and the tears filling them were real this time. They were tears of raw, unqualified fear. Derek went down on his knees at the edge of the Turkish rug, the fabric of his expensive suit pressed against the floor. He brought his hands together and began to beg. The shift from ruthless extortionist to sobbing supplicant happened with a speed that was almost pathetic to witness. He implored Gerald to stop the legal machinery. He begged his father to contact the attorney and pull the criminal complaint back. He sobbed that he was deeply sorry, that financial desperation had driven him to it, that he'd had no other exit. He claimed he had been drowning in debt and couldn't locate any other way through. He implored Gerald to deploy his wealth to settle the fraudulent credit line and make the bank investigators go away. He reminded his father that he was his only son. He asked how a father could bring himself to send his own child to a federal penitentiary. Nadia joined the desperate appeal without hesitation. She dropped her earlier effort to blame Derek entirely and moved to stand behind him. She pressed her trembling hands together and implored Gerald for mercy. She reached for the fatherly protection they had so casually thrown away just days before. Any attempt to call, email, or physically approach Gerald would result in an immediate felony arrest. The officer planted his hand on his utility belt and leaned forward into the space between them. He told Derek directly, vacate the property this moment, or he would be put on the floor in handcuffs for criminal trespassing. Derek stared at the restraining order, trembling in his grip. A last feeble ember of his arrogance flared somewhere in his chest. He wanted to recover even a fragment of dignity in front of the uniformed officers. He tried to pull his shoulders back and project the bearing of a composed corporate man. He opened his mouth and called it a serious family misunderstanding. He stammered that he was simply a concerned son attempting to arrange appropriate medical care for an aging parent. The officer shut it down immediately. He told Derek to close his mouth. The property, he stated, was held by an independent corporate trust, and Derek had no legal standing to be in the room. He pointed toward the open front door and ordered both of them out. Nadia dissolved into loud, uncontrolled sobbing. Every trace of the polished suburban housewife was gone. Her expensive makeup ran in dark, uneven tracks down her face. She seized Derek by the sleeve of his ruined suit and dragged him toward the hallway. "Stop talking," she told him, "and get out before they ended up in a cell." Derek swallowed what was left of his pride and gave a slow nod. He pushed his hand into his trouser pocket and produced the electronic key fob to his imported luxury sedan sitting in the driveway. He fixed Gerald with a look of pure, concentrated resentment. He muttered something about retaining his own lawyers and challenging the corporate trust in federal court. Gerald stood without moving. His gaze went to the key fob clenched in his son's unsteady hand. He decided to cut the final thread of their unearned privilege. He turned to the lead officer and stated without inflection that the vehicle Derek was moving toward did not belong to him. Derek stopped completely. His foot hung above the floor. He turned and stared at his father in flat disbelief. Gerald laid out the financial reality without excess. He explained to the officer that the imported sedan Derek drove and the luxury sport utility vehicle Nadia had arrived in had never been purchased in their names. He had acquired both vehicles years earlier under the corporate umbrella of his logistics firm as a straightforward tax arrangement. They were registered as corporate fleet assets. When Gerald transferred his full estate into the irrevocable blind trust physical ownership of both vehicles had passed automatically to the new corporate entity. Gerald looked directly at his son. He told Derek that the corporate trust was formally reclaiming its property right now. He informed the officer that any attempt by Derek to drive that vehicle off the property would constitute grand theft auto. The officer narrowed his eyes and stepped squarely into Derek's personal space. He held out an open hand and told him to surrender the keys. He would not ask again. The reality of absolute destitution finally buckled something deep in Derek. He had no funds, no leverage, no legal ground to stand on. His trembling fingers uncurled one by one, and the key fob dropped into the officer's waiting hand. Nadia made a small broken sound. She dug into her designer purse and pulled out the keys to her imported sport utility vehicle. She dropped them onto the oak coffee table alongside the toxicology report. Every high-end possession they had taken for granted was gone. The officers extended no sympathy. They gripped Derek and Nadia by the shoulders and walked them out through the front door. The afternoon air met them on the porch, but it offered nothing. Gerald followed as far as the edge of the wooden porch and stopped. He set both hands on the painted railing. He stood straight and unyielding as he watched the officers escort his son and daughter-in-law down the long concrete driveway. Nadia lurched unsteadily in her expensive heels, her ankles buckling on the hard pavement as she wept. Derek moved with his chin dropped to his chest. Shoulders collapsed forward in the posture of a man who had surrendered everything. His feet barely cleared the ground as he went like a man walking a road he had no strength left to resist. They reached the far edge of the property where the trimmed lawn gave way to the rough surface of the public street. The officers halted at that boundary and held their position like a wall. Arms folded, they kept their eyes fixed on the couple, making certain neither of them took a single step back toward the house. Derek fished his mobile phone from his pocket with unsteady fingers. He stood on the public curb beside his weeping wife and stared at the small glowing screen. This was a man who had walked up that driveway expecting to claim a financial kingdom and walk away with a massive estate. Now he was standing on the edge of a suburban road, frantically trying to arrange a cheap cab to carry him back to an apartment he could no longer pay for. Gerald watched their shrinking figures from the elevated quiet of his porch. The soft afternoon air moved across his face. He watched the red and blue light from the police cruisers play across the glossy paint of the repossessed luxury vehicles sitting in his driveway. Not a trace of regret passed through him. The crushing weight he had carried in silence across too many years had lifted completely. He had cut the source of that rot out of his life with methodical precision. The natural order of things had been restored. Gerald turned away from the two figures at the end of his street. He walked back inside at an unhurried pace, pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him, and left them entirely to the justice, waiting for them in the wider world. 3 weeks passed. The morning sun broke over the horizon and spread warm, golden light across the quiet lawns of the neighborhood. Gerald stood in the center of his large kitchen. The house was completely still. It was not the dense, suffocating quiet of a man bracing for the next psychological blow. It was the deep and settled silence of a sanctuary that had been defended and made permanently secure. Gerald reached for the glass carafe on the granite countertop. He ran filtered water from the tap and watched it fill. He took a slow breath of relief, knowing that the water supply flowing through his home was no longer a vehicle for chemical assault. He poured the water into the reservoir of his coffee maker and listened to the low hum of the heating element warming up. The simple ritual of brewing his morning cup felt in its own way like a quiet triumph. He had waged a grinding, invisible war to hold on to his right to stand in this kitchen and do exactly this. He drew a ceramic mug from the cabinet and filled it with dark and steaming black tea, feeling the warmth seep through the thick ceramic into his hands. He took a slow sip. The rich, grounding flavor pulled him into the present. He was safe. He was his own man. His life was entirely in his own hands. Gerald moved through the kitchen doorway and into the formal dining room. A tidy stack of legal documents, crisp and white, sat squarely in the center of the mahogany table. Clifton had sent them over the previous afternoon. Gerald settled into his heavy wooden chair and set his mug carefully alongside the papers. He had no need to read through them. Clifton had already called to walk him through every detail of the outcome. The fraudulent home equity line of credit Derek had illegally opened against the property had been fully expunged from the financial record. The commercial bank had classified the transaction as a deliberate act of identity theft and formally severed every financial obligation connecting Gerald to the stolen funds. His credit history, unblemished across decades, had been completely restored by the major reporting agencies. The property he had built alongside his late wife carried no debt and no encumbrance. It sat securely inside the legal fortress of the Blind Trust, managed by an independent corporate board that ensured no predatory family member would ever reach a single dollar of it. Gerald ran his fingertips across the smooth face of the top document. He felt the embossed seal of the notary beneath his fingers. These papers were the formal record of order restored. He had used the framework of the financial and legal system to construct a defensive structure that nothing could penetrate. The sheer scale of the forgery had left the bank's experienced fraud investigators visibly shaken. They had examined the altered medical proxies and the digitally manipulated signatures with something close to disbelief. Derek had left a clear and traceable trail of digital fingerprints across the banking servers. He had initiated the wire transfers from his own corporate terminal. He had routed the stolen capital directly into the hemorrhaging accounts of his software startup. It was a desperate and sloppy move, the act of a man so convinced of his own invincibility that he hadn't bothered to cover his tracks. The investigators had assured Clifton that Gerald would never face a single collection agency or be compelled to defend his property rights in a civil proceeding. The bank had absorbed the financial loss entirely and turned its full legal apparatus toward pursuing the man actually responsible. Gerald felt the deep satisfaction of complete vindication. His patience, the long, deliberate, meticulous patience of his preparation, had spared him months of bureaucratic torment. He had let the truth work as his weapon and allowed the system to do what it was designed to do. Gerald took another slow sip and let his thoughts settle on the people who had orchestrated his near destruction. He held no smoldering anger toward his son or his daughter-in-law. Anger demanded an emotional expenditure he was no longer prepared to make. What remained was something colder and more precise, a clear-eyed awareness of where they now stood. The wreckage Derek and Nadia had brought down upon themselves was immense. The software startup Derek had been so desperate to rescue had folded completely. The moment the federal criminal investigation became public, the venture capital money vanished. Corporate creditors closed in on the hollow remains of the company and stripped out whatever could be liquidated. Derek was bankrupt in every meaningful sense. No income, no standing, no leverage. The luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, the entire constructed lifestyle built on borrowed money and stolen assets, all of it erased. But the financial collapse was only where the reckoning began. The Commercial Crimes Unit had assembled the evidence Gerald provided into an airtight case. The high-definition surveillance footage, the certified toxicology reports, and the forged property authorizations told a story of cold, deliberate, premeditated malice that left no room for interpretation. The federal prosecutor had officially indicted Derek on multiple counts of grand larceny, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Nadia faced separate charges of premeditated aggravated assault and the attempted poisoning of a vulnerable senior citizen. They were no longer polished suburban socialites coasting on unearned privilege. They were criminal defendants, staring at decades in a federal penitentiary. Every social connection they had worked so hard to cultivate had dissolved the moment the indictments became public. The affluent circle that used to fill their dinner parties now looked straight through them. The isolation they had tried to impose on Gerald had become their own inescapable condition. Gerald understood that the trial ahead would be a harsh and very public affair. Every manipulation, every calculated deception, every fabricated symptom would be laid out in open court. They would stand before a federal judge and be required to explain why they had attempted to chemically incapacitate and permanently institutionalize an innocent man. Gerald had no intention of sitting in that courtroom to watch it unfold. He had no desire to be present for their final reckoning. There was no pleasure in it for him. He took no satisfaction in the destruction of his own bloodline. What became of their lives now lay entirely outside his concern. He had spent 40 years subordinating his own needs to ensure they had every advantage available to them. He had given them unconditional love and steady, unwavering support. They had taken that generosity and bent it into a weapon aimed at him. They had read his quiet endurance as weakness and decided it could be exploited without consequence. They had calculated that a father would simply surrender his life rather than stand and fight. Gerald had moved through a genuine period of mourning during the weeks he spent auditing his accounts and building his case in silence. He had grieved for the son he believed he had shaped into a decent man. He had shed his tears over the ruin of his family long before he ever faced them across his living room. By the time they set their chemical trap, the grief was already behind him, processed, accepted, finished. The man sitting quietly at the mahogany table with his mug of black tea was no longer a vulnerable father clutching the fraying threads of a family that no longer existed. He was a sovereign individual who had identified a threat to his survival, neutralized it completely, and reclaimed his life. He had given them the most painful and necessary lesson they would ever receive. He had proven that boundaries could not be crossed without severe and catastrophic consequences. He had demonstrated that silence was not surrender, but a terrifying form of patient observation. Gerald rose from the mahogany table, wrapping both hands around his warm ceramic mug of dark and steaming black tea. He moved at an unhurried pace through the spacious living room and made his way toward the large glass doors at the back of the house. He pressed the heavy door open and stepped out onto the wooden patio. The morning air was crisp and remarkably clean. He gazed out over the immaculate landscape before him. Vibrant green grass stretched evenly toward the tall wooden fence at the yard's edge. The colorful flower beds Miriam had planted were in full bloom beneath the early sunlight. The old maple tree threw a long, comforting shadow across the ground below. This was his sanctuary. It was the physical embodiment of a lifetime of honest labor and quiet dedication, a space that demanded respect and commanded dignity. Gerald stood near the patio's edge and drew in a slow breath of fresh air. A profound and restorative weight settled across his shoulders. It was the weight of reclaimed autonomy. He was no longer a prisoner inside his own home. He was no longer a victim bracing for the next predatory strike. He had successfully upended the power dynamic and crushed the arrogance of those who had set out to destroy him. He had shielded his sacred memories and secured his physical freedom. The toxic elements that had poisoned his existence were permanently excised. Gerald took a final sip from his mug and smiled softly at the quiet beauty of his garden. He had finally achieved the ultimate hard-won peace that he rightfully deserved. The war was officially over. He had defended his kingdom with absolute precision. He closed his eyes and listened to the gentle rustling of the maple leaves in the morning breeze. Gerald didn't just survive what Derek and Nadia put him through. He dismantled it, piece by piece, with patience and precision that most people never find when they need it most. What this cost him was real. The grief of watching his own son become a predator. The quiet humiliation of having his mind questioned his home, weaponized his late wife Miriam's memory, used as leverage against him. He carried all of that, and he kept moving. I believe God has a way of arming the righteous with exactly what they need at exactly the right moment, not always loudly. Sometimes in the form of a thermal friction pen, a hidden camera, and 40 years of hard-won wisdom. Here's what Gerald's story teaches. Document everything. A verbal agreement protects no one. Paper records and dated evidence are the only currency that holds when someone decides to rewrite the story. If someone pressures you to sign, quickly slow down. Urgency is a manipulation tool. The moment someone needs your signature before you've had time to think, that is your signal to stop and think harder. Protect your assets before you need to. An irrevocable trust is not a wealthy person's luxury. It is a fence you build before the wolves arrive, not after. Never confuse silence with weakness. Gerald said nothing until he had everything. That restraint was not passivity. It was the sharpest weapon in the room. If this story moved you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it. An aging parent, a neighbor, a friend who has been made to feel small in their own home. Leave your thoughts in the comments. I read them and they matter to me. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Family Revenge Stories, so you never miss one of these, thank you sincerely for spending this time with me today. Until the next story, take care of yourself and the people you love.